Thank you all for being here with us today. And thank you, Sarah, for not just the introduction, but the extraordinary work you do leading the World Wellbeing Movement. Now only, what is it, about a year and a half old, but already leading to much impact. And I think this is today's testimony to that. And as Sarah said, stay tuned because there's a lot coming, especially early in the new year, when we will be launching with and through the World Wellbeing Movement a menu of interventions in digestible format for all of you to find out the best evidence on how to actually move the needle on improving workplace well-being. But today, the topic really is about the business case for investing in workplace well-being. And I've prepared a lot of material for you, and I'm going to be talking quite a bit, but I'm going to run through all of the material I've prepared in order to be able to get to Q&A. And I think you'll be able to put your questions, and please do share all of your questions in the chat function. And Jonathan and Sarah will then pick and choose, and hopefully we can get through as many questions as we possibly can. But I have prepared a lot of material for you. I'm proud of the fact that together with a large team of mostly young, brilliant researchers, we've put together a lot of good evidence, I think, on the relationship between workplace well-being and productivity, retention, talent attraction, and ultimately the larger business case. And I'm going to share some of these studies with you, including one that's based on the world's largest study of workplace well-being in partnership with Indeed. So I'm going to run you through all of this material by structuring it through essentially 4 empirical questions. And the first one is really just to get us all on the same page, which is to how do we here at the Wellbeing Research Centre and the World Wellbeing Movement think about measuring workplace well-being? What have we seen out there? How are we doing so at a scale not seen before? And then we're going to be using that to look into, well, all that is good and well, but what drives it? And what is the relative importance of some of the qualitative dimensions that we obviously all experience at work, from pay to flexibility to sense of belonging? And I'll tell you which ones, all of them are important, but some happen to be more important than others in explaining variance between how people feel at work. And then obviously the meat of today's presentation and our discussion will be about, does any of this matter for productivity, recruitment, retention? And I'll share the very best evidence on all 3 of these. And then all 3 of these channels or pathways to performance, as I tend to call them, I'm going to share with you the results of a major study that links how workplace well-being generally at a firm or organization links to their financial performance and ultimately even their stock market performance. And there's some exciting developments on that front, and I'm keen to share and get there with you. So without further ado, and please, any questions, put them in chat. Let's get started on getting ourselves all on the same page, I would hope. And that's to think about definitions and how do we measure workplace well-being and do so at a scale not seen before. Well, first things first, the way we approach workplace well-being and how to measure it is going from the perspective that there's only one way of finding out whether Sarah or Jonathan or any one of you on this call is happy at work, and that's by asking you. While we may be experts, we're not expert enough to know how you feel at work. We need to ask you to do so. And so we're squarely in the field of, for the aficionados, subjective well-being or subjective workplace well-being. And within that, we tend to distinguish between how we feel at work, which is an experience of the workplace, which gets measured through questions such as, do you feel happy at work most of the time? Or do you feel stressed at work most of the time, which is the negative spectrum of that experiential well-being item, but also a more evaluative set of questions, such as, my work has a sense of purpose, or perhaps the workhorse for our field, which is job satisfaction. In other words, do you feel satisfied with the work you do? That is thinking about your work rather than just experiencing it. But it's important, and I can give you many examples why, if we have more time, for why it's important to distinguish between these more affective or experiential, more evaluative, and possibly also eudaimonic, which is philosophical language for a sort of a sense of purpose and meaning. And so that's how we capture or how we promote the idea of measuring workplace well-being. So happiness, stress, reverse coded, of course, a sense of purpose, and especially job satisfaction. Now, one thing that I think all of us need to think about very importantly, actually, and that I think many people in this Zoom webinar may be doing wrongly, in my modest opinion, is that we tend to often confuse the ends and the means, or the inputs and the outputs. When we think of workplace well-being as measured through the 4 items that you see on the screen as an index, or just these single items, these are very much outcomes. They're sort of the outcome of the work experience or work as a whole. They're not the reasons why you feel the way you do. Those would be better considered drivers or correlates or inputs or pillars or dimensions or whatever you want to call it. But I see many organizations essentially confuse means and ends and put elements such as job satisfaction right next to flexibility. And these flexibility and the like are very important, but they're not an outcome measure. And for anybody who's an academic, you'll understand why this is also so important. Is because in order to understand what explains the outcome, you need to be able to run a regression or a driver analysis. And that does require you to put something on the left-hand side of the equation and have things to explain it with on the right-hand side of the equation. So from an engineering perspective, if you will, you need something, a KPI to optimize on in order to find out where to invest your money and do so with an evidence base. If you put everything at the same level and you put the means and the ends next to each other in some kind of index or a dashboard, then it becomes really hard to distinguish what is actually driving what and where to invest your resources into. But I'm already getting distracted from the business case that I want to get to. How do we measure this at a scale I don't think ever seen before, which is you need a wonderful partner. And we here at Oxford found an extraordinary partner in Indeed, the job search engine, who's active around, I think, about 30 markets globally, where now we are crowdsourcing, guess what, the 4 items we've seen on the previous screen. So job satisfaction, work happiness, stress, and purpose. And in addition to those, also a whole host of drivers, items that can explain why we feel the way we do. And you see some of these appear on the screen. We are now well over 17 million employees who have put in their company reviews. So we've got about 300 million data points and counting. And it's just really, really exciting. And it's the mother of all data sets, we like to think. And it will, and it has been producing insights into workplace well-being. You should know that in the United States alone, we have over 200,000 organizations that we can now compare like for like in terms of how people feel at these places. And that's by crowdsourcing with current or former employees through the Indeed platform, asking them these kind of questions about their current or past employer. What it looks like is essentially this. So Indeed is amazing because they then make these data available as soon as there's enough data. And you can actually go in the UK, Canada, and the United States, especially the big organizations all have their work well-being scores, which is essentially the average of these 4 outcome items. And I'm showing off Walmart just to also give you a sense of the richness of the data. So if you look more carefully at the slide, we have no less than 166,000 and counting employees, current or past, of Walmart who've already responded to this survey. So it gives you a sense of just the richness and the breadth of the data that we have. Some of the things we're starting to see coming back from this very large study that is ongoing, of course, is that there's a lot of variation between organizations. So that's good news and bad news. Because obviously the good news means that there is a lot of variation. So it means that we have something to study and something to move the needle on. So what you're seeing here is just on these 4 outcome items of happiness, purpose, stress, and job satisfaction, you see that people are being asked to answer this on a scale from 1 to 5. And you'll see that at the organizational level, there's a huge variation, with some organizations having an average of below 2 on work happiness and others well above 4 out of 5 on work happiness. So there's something to this, and it's wonderful in a way for us academics because it means there's a lot to explain, and we can look for a lot of variation for explaining why there's such differences in organizational performance in terms of well-being. And once we get to the end of this webinar, you'll also see that this variation is really important because there is a big difference in the performance between these organizations, and that's probably in no small part driven by the variation in well-being to begin with. And that's something you'll pick up in the business case later on. Now, I showed you there's a lot of variation between organizations, but there's also a lot of variation even within industries. So if you look at, I'm now using American data, but we can do this for the UK, Canada, and other markets that are coming live. You'll see there's a lot of variation between companies, even within a very standardized industry. So if you look and think, for example, of the hamburger industry, where ultimately most people are doing a very basic job that is quite standardized across industry, yet you will see huge differences in how people feel in these places. So from McDonald's to In-N-Out, which is well known in the States, especially on the West Coast, as a place where there's a very different vibe to, for example, McDonald's. And this is picked up in our data. And if you think about what you'll see later in this presentation, this truly is a competitive advantage for In-N-Out on all fronts, not just in productivity and engagement and customer satisfaction, but also in attracting talent and retaining talent. And it's the same across other industries like the retail industry. And it's the case for all 4 of these outcome measures. I want to do one final thing in showing off the data, which is that for the bigger players like Walmart, Amazon, McDonald's, UPS, and we can do this in the States, Canada, the UK at this point, but also other markets are coming live. The data is so rich that at this point we can even split by region or even plants and warehouses. One could almost argue that at this point we may even know better how people feel at Walmart than Walmart does itself. And that's because we have data rolling in and geographically identifiable between places such as the level of the state. Now, what you're seeing here, and I think the main takeaway before I move along, is that there are big differences, but it also means that even in industries that are not particularly well known for workplace well-being, even in organizations that aren't particularly well known for well-being, even in locations that are not associated with great workplace well-being, you will find examples of organizations that do well, where people feel good and report that way. And that, I think, is probably, if I may, a positive, optimistic, and probably the most general message coming out of this massive study so far, which is that you will always find examples that it can be done and can be done better. And that's exciting and aspirational. And I think the graph that you see on the screen at the moment is suggestive and indicative of that. Let me move to section 2, because I'm still in the preparation phase for the business case itself. And that is to show off a little bit of what we're finding helps explain the variance between organizations and workplaces. And we don't just ask people about how they feel at work or about their work. We also ask people about whether they feel they're being valued by their coworkers, whether they feel a sense of belonging, whether they're being compensated fairly, have flexibility, and have supportive people, etc. Now, these things are very much helping explain why people feel the way they do. So we consider them drivers or inputs. And if we had more time and a smaller group, then we could have and start a conversation about, well, which of these drivers do you think matters most to you and your well-being at work, or to your team's well-being at work? And what's interesting is we've actually asked this of managers and workers alike. And what we find comes out on top is typically, and this obviously suits a neoclassical economist, tends to be compensation, and then flexibility, followed by inclusion and more. And so this is what people think drives well-being. But when we actually run the analysis, and this is another major insight, I think, coming through from this major study, is that when we actually run the analysis to see what is most correlated with or explains most of the variance in elements such as job satisfaction and work happiness, or workplace well-being more generally, it's not compensation nor flexibility. What we find is that some of the things that were at the bottom half of the pack rise to the very top. And in particular, trust and especially belonging. And I'll say a bit more about that in a second. But I want to emphasize that what you're seeing on the screen is really rather powerful. It shows that what people tend to think, including HR managers, believe is making you tick in the workplace, isn't always correct. And so investments in improving workplace well-being may end up going into improving compensation, which obviously remains important, especially if you're at the bottom end of the pay scale, or flexibility. But really, ultimately, what makes people feel good about their work or at work is our notions that probably have more to do with social capital. And let me say a bit more about belonging. If you were not putting belonging at the very top of your list, then you wouldn't be alone. In fact, only about 6% of people put managers, only about 6% of managers rate belonging at the very top of their drivers. And if you want to find out a bit more what this means, feeling a sense of belonging, we dug a bit deeper in this, and we asked respondents, so what does a sense of belonging really mean to you? And ultimately it comes down to feeling that the company cares about you as a person, in other words, a human being. And also importantly, and we've seen this before, having friends at work. Our friends at Gallup have made it very clear to me, and rightfully so, that when they used the Gallup Q12 engagement survey, one of the elements in the Gallup Q12 is a question that people typically laugh a little bit at, which is, do you have a best friend at work? Now, it turns out that that particular item happens to be the most strongest predictor of job satisfaction. And so it's very powerful insights that have come through Gallup that we essentially replicate here in this big study and in other studies we've done. So it's having social connections, social capital at work, and in particular, obviously the link with the line manager is particularly important. And so you cannot underestimate this sense of belonging and that all of that social capital ultimately generates. And that is what is attractive to people, and this is what makes them stay and feel good at work. All right, let's move along. In the interest of time, and I hope questions are coming up for you, let me now move to the meat of the presentation, and I think what you're really here for, which is the business case. And let me start with reasons why workplace well-being may end up improving for performance. And I'm going to structure this by way of looking at the links to productivity, recruitment, and retention. Very pleased to say that we now have causal field evidence on all three of these pathways to firm performance. And the first one is productivity, something that my colleagues, George Ward, Clément Bellet, and I have worked on for a very long time. In fact, our study in collaboration with British Telecom started almost 10 years ago. It was, I'm pleased to say, published earlier this year in the very top academic journal called Management Science, peer-reviewed and of the highest caliber. And so we were able to show, I think for the first time in the field, and provide causal evidence for the very basic link between how we feel and how productive we are as individuals. Now, this is something that's been part of management methodology for a very long time, but it's very difficult to show this link, which will be intuitive to all of you, to show this in the field and do so with causal evidence. And I'll tell you how we got there in the end. So what we did with BT is we essentially pulsed all of their call center employees every Thursday at 4 p.m. and asked them how happy they feel that week. Literally a bit like a calendar invite coming in. They clicked one of these smileys and off it went. So very light touch, but it gave us a weekly sense for how people in the call centers at British Telecom felt. And we then tied this to the performance data. And one element that's obviously an advantage for research at call centers is that the call center employees have very detailed and granular level of performance data for them. And so whether it's from the seconds per call, the customer satisfaction coming back to weekly sales, all of that we were able to link back to how they felt from one week to another. So let me share you some basic results. What you're seeing here is the average weekly happiness coming back by call center, so from Middlesbrough to Newcastle and Warrington. And what you're seeing here is something very basic, not yet causal, very much correlational, but very powerful and suggestive already, which is that the average weekly employee happiness is very strongly correlated with the weekly customer satisfaction reports coming back for these call centers. So however people feel at the call center from one week to another, very strongly correlated with how customers are made to feel as a response. Now, this is correlational. The main result really is around this particular graph, which is that at the individual level, if you track an individual over time, the differences in how one feels over time turn out to be causally impactful on the weekly sales and other performance metrics. But we focus on sales because it's perhaps the most potent. And so what you're finding here is if you move somebody from not feeling good to feeling good from one week to another, we would expect there to be an average treatment effect or an average impact of about 12-13% in terms of weekly sales. Now, one thing I want to point out immediately is I insist that this is an average effect. When you actually split the types of jobs that people do at call centers and everywhere else, you find that some jobs actually have more or require a heightened sense of social and emotional intelligence than others. So, for example, in the case of call center employees, we actually split the types of sales they did into three kinds. Ones that were really just order taking, that didn't require much thinking or social and emotional intelligence. And then others that required a lot of social and emotional intelligence, such as trying to retain a disgruntled customer, that I might call it. And so what we found is that the effect of how you felt on your sale or on your performance very much dependent on the type of activity they were doing. So while the average effect is about 12%, for something that's sort of lower order tasks like order taking, we didn't find much of an impact of how you felt. However, for tasks that were more complex in nature, and especially those that required retaining difficult customers and really activating your social and emotional intelligence, the effect was a lot larger. So what we're finding here, we think, is very much a lower bound effect of how one feels on how productive one is. In most organizations, probably the ones that you're at and the kind of work you do, you will require social and emotional intelligence most of the time. Well, guess what? It's very difficult to activate that and be effective at it if you're not feeling great yourself. And that is very strongly shown in our study here. Now, I said that we spent a hell of a lot of time moving this from correlational to causal field evidence. And I'm not going to spend too much time now boring you with the details, but I do want to give you a hint of how we moved from correlation to causation. And the way we did it was essentially leveraging the weather differences between these call centers. Because to move from correlation to causation, you essentially need an instrument, an experimental setup, something that manipulates people's well-being without it manipulating the customer's well-being, and then see how that influences the productivity of the employee. And what we use is the weather differences across these call centers, from Dundee to Truro, so from all the way up in Scotland to all the way down in southwest England. And while the weather generally in the UK is not great, there are lots of differences nonetheless. And so we picked up on those differences, and we looked for weather differences that were, we essentially mapped out the weather each week right at the location of these call centers. So a huge effort. And what we found is that the weather itself had an impact on how people felt, and we used that. But really, the referees at the journal and our peers really pushed us to go one step further. What you're seeing here is 3 images, and they are images of the call centers, or 3 of the call centers that we studied. And some of them, you'll note, have lots of windows, and some don't. And so we use the differences in the exposure to weather, i.e. the share of windows in a building, to mix that with the actual weather differences to have a variable for exposure to weather, to bad weather in particular. And so we use that, and by the way, we used an algorithm to try and capture window share out of a building. And though that still wasn't enough, so what we then did is to see whether the workers in these call centers actually corroborated our algorithm and actually said that, yes, the natural light that I'm seeing or the window share in our building is correlated with what we observed from the outside. So the exciting news here is that, and I'm not going to, again, bore you with it, but the results are really strong. And what we find is on all the performance outcomes, conversion being sales, calls per hour, or adherence to schedule, we find a strong positive impact on people's labor productivity. And we are accounting for omitted variable bias and reverse causality. Anyway, I would love to dig more into this, but I know we need to move on to other items if we want to be able to have a bit of time in Q&A. So I think it's pretty clear, and the academic world has agreed with us, that we've now settled the causal evidence question on productivity. But there are other pathways through which well-being may matter for company performance. And one is recruitment. And here, our brilliant research fellow, George Ward, who was my student and then did his PhD at the MIT, did a study leveraging the Indeed platform, which is really path-breaking on this particular front. And I think he produced the first causal field evidence to show that how people feel at work influences the attractiveness as employer. So nowadays, how people feel at work, it gets captured through crowdsourced portals such as Glassdoor and obviously Indeed increasingly, and that's made public. And so the extent to which people respond to this shapes their job search behavior. And George, what he was able to do, and sit tight, he used 24 million job seekers, 24 million job seekers who were randomly assigned to either seeing the average workplace well-being through our crowdsourced survey for an organization, and the control group did not see, and so the other half of the job seekers did not see that information. Now, what George found, so obviously on the screen you see the treatment, the control group, and what they saw for an organization such as MIT. Now, what George found is essentially that if you show how people feel at an organization, well, then job seekers will, in the margins, but still significantly so, start moving away or moving their job search behavior away from the below average well-being companies. So this is exciting. So anybody who's in the HR space, this will be very relevant to you, because it means that this information, which is increasingly made transparent, in other words, information about how people feel at your workplace, that is going to start drive your attractiveness as an employer even more than it already does through word of mouth. All right, so that is the talent recruitment side of things. Let me quickly touch on the retention side. Here too, there's a lot of now wonderful field evidence showing that the most obvious thing of all, which is if people feel good at work or think highly of their work, they are more likely to stay in place. That is also backed up by a cute little study by Glassdoor, which is another organization that crowdsources how people feel. And what Glassdoor found is essentially that people, the star rating they give to their employer is highly predictive of whether or not people go out to look for other jobs. So in this particular case, what you're seeing is if people give their organization 2 stars rather than 5, they're twice as likely to go look for a job in that same week. So this is highly telling. It's a cute little study that really resonates, I think, with all of us and makes the case for something rather intuitive. So this, in a way, I think, allows us to move more towards a conceptual idea of workplace well-being, and the fact that there's these pathways to performance that run through productivity, talent recruitment, talent retention, and possibly raising investment through ESG, which we'll get onto later, I hope. But it shows you that we're starting to get a really good empirical grasp of all the elements of workplace well-being, both how to measure it, actually measuring it at a scale not seen before, what the downstream impact is on people from productivity onwards, but also what might help explain variation in workplace well-being. And then you saw lots of items that can fit under relationships or development and security, risk, health and safety, earnings and benefits, independence and flexibility, you name it. So we're starting to get a good sense of how to measure it, what drives it, and what the downstream impact of all of this is. Now, while I have given you the first causal field evidence for improving well-being, raising productivity, I have not yet given you a business case. And I know that is the title of this webinar. And the reason why I have not yet given you a business case is because all the studies I've so far mentioned have only taken into account the positives of improving workplace well-being. So at British Telecom, when we see an improvement in workplace well-being, we see improvements in customer satisfaction and weekly sales and much else. But if you want a business case to take to the CFO or the CEO, you still need to take into account the cost side of this as well. So you could still be facing a CFO who's skeptical and says, great, I trust you that it's true, that if you can improve workplace well-being for somebody in a significant way, then that will raise weekly sales by, say, 12% in a significant way. But what does it cost to try and raise, or what investment is required to raise people's well-being by this much? And this is why we need to move to an organization level study where we take into account both the benefits of raising well-being, of doing well on this front, but also obviously the costs associated with it. And while I'm not going to be able to show you the precise costing of an investment in well-being, what I can show you is that whatever companies do to improve well-being, whatever it takes them, whatever resources are being put into play to generate an environment where people feel good at work and about their work, well, it seems to pay off, despite whatever the cost may be. And that's what I'm about to show you on the next slide, and I'm really excited about. And it's these results. And I'll show you some more in a second. But these are the most basic results that have come back from our study, again, leveraging the Indeed Work Wellbeing survey, where we have looked at all the, or pretty much all the US traded firms on the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ. And we have data for most of them about how people feel at these places. They tend to be large places to begin with, needless to say. But the reason why these companies are interesting is because they need to report on a quarterly basis standardized metrics about how people feel, about how they do financially. And now what we did is obviously tie that to how people feel at these companies. And what you're seeing here is the average company well-being, which is the average of these 4 outcome measures of happiness, stress, purpose, and satisfaction, and 3 standard financial outcomes. One is firm value, the other one is return on assets, and the other one is gross profitability. And this is correlational, not causal, but what you're seeing here is that companies who invest in improving workplace well-being, at whatever cost it might be, it seems to be very strongly correlated with all of the standard financial performance metrics. So there might be a cost to Google or Microsoft to improve workplace well-being. That could be through higher salaries. It could be through generating a better culture, through organizing psychological safety, through more flexibility. Whatever it takes, it seems to be paying off. By the way, the blue dots that you're seeing are the deciles in terms of workplace well-being. So there's about 1,600 listed firms that we have comparable data for and financial comparable data for. And we've put these into from the bottom decile to the top decile. And again, the first thing you'll note is that the big differences in average well-being. So the bottom decile amongst the listed firms is below 2.5 out of 5 in terms of average well-being. The top decile in terms of workplace well-being for listed firms is over 3.5 out of 5. So that's a big difference to begin with. And it correlates very strongly with these financial performance metrics. Now, I said that this was correlational. I'm not going to be able to show you causal evidence on this, but we are pushing hard in that direction. And so one way of doing that, for example, is to use stagger this out over time and see whether well-being might be a leading indicator of financial performance. And what you're seeing here is data for these large companies that are listed in the United States. And we're looking at well-being before COVID hit, and we're looking at financial performance post-COVID. So what you're seeing here is pre-COVID well-being on post-COVID financial returns. And so there's definitely a predictive element to it. But again, we're not yet speaking causal language, but there's definitely something going on here and a very strong relationship between how people feel at work and how well the company does financially. Now, another way of looking at this over time and seeing whether well-being is a leading indicator of performance at the organizational level, and thus helping you present a business case for it, is by looking at financial stock market returns. So what you're seeing here is just the indices, the NASDAQ 100, the S&P 500, and the Dow Jones. And we've got data for those, obviously stretching back quite a while, but relevant to our workplace well-being study. I'm looking at 2021, 2022, and sort of the first quarter of 2023. All of you will remember 2021 was a a bull run with the markets doing really well. 2022 was a disaster, very much of a bear market, and especially for the Nasdaq. And then 2023 so far has been a volatile year so far, needless to say. And that's obviously what you see in these indices. Now, what I'm about to show you is what would happen if you use workplace well-being data from the past year, and essentially invest based on the workplace well-being data. So in other words, build a portfolio of work companies, simply screen on how people feel in those places and see where people feel good, these companies outperform in the stock market subsequently. And what I'm about to show you now is exactly that. So what you're seeing here is an index, if you will, of the best places to work as people as crowdsourced through our survey on Indeed with a lot of people so far. So this is again about the 1,600 or so companies that are listed on the New York Stock Exchange and the Dow Jones. And what I'm doing here is actually quite simple. We use 2020 data to set a portfolio in motion on January 1st, 2021, and we let it run. And what you're seeing here is that the 2020 well-being data would have helped you outperform, or these companies outperformed tremendously in 2021. And then you rejig your portfolio in light of which companies have been great places to work for, which is typically about a quarter to a third of the portfolio would move in and out. And then you sort of launch it again at the start of 22 and let it run for a year. And then do the same thing again on January 1st, 2023. What you're seeing here is essentially something that my colleague Alex Edmonds calls the fact that the stock market doesn't quite fully capture the intangibles, such as how people feel at work. And so companies where people feel good at work are more likely to have positive earnings surprises, is what Alex would say, what he found, and he's right. And we're essentially backing this up at a much larger scale at this point, and we'll be extending these data subsequently. You'll be pleased to know that this is now independently corroborated or backed up by BlackRock, the big fund, who now also have access to the aggregated Indeed data and have been looking at this as an investment strategy. So that's the work well-being score in action, and seeing the extent to which it is worthwhile investing in well-being, because even from an investor perspective, there's much to be gained. And obviously CEOs and CFOs do seem to care a lot about how their stock, for the large companies that is, performs. Now, all of what I said over the past 40 minutes or so will have come across to, especially people on this call, as very intuitive. But the fact, and you would be right, most leaders that have been surveyed in Harvard Business Review survey that we co-organized reported indeed that they think that prioritizing well-being can give their organization a competitive advantage. But when it comes down to it, when push comes to shove and you push them a little bit, they all acknowledge that really only about a third make it an actual strategic priority when it comes down to it. And that is quite disconcerting. And something to take home, but also in a way a hopeful message, in the sense that there's much room for improvement. For companies that do invest in workplace well-being, there's definitely a competitive advantage to be gained. I came across a study recently by a dear colleague of mine, Stefan Meyer, who's a professor of strategy at Columbia Business School, which shows and backs up this in a very, very cute way, and something that I think will resonate with all of you. I'm sure all of you will be faced with CEOs and CFOs that will show some skepticism about investing and how people feel at work and your people. You'll be pleased to hear, although maybe not pleased, but at least pleased to hear that it probably confirms your thinking, which is that when Stefan Meyer and his team analyzed earnings calls of the major organizations that happen every quarter, because every quarter the CEO and CFO essentially meet with the investor community and talk through the financial results, Stefan analyzed through natural language processing all the investor calls of the major organizations. What he found is that the word customer comes in 10 times more as a stakeholder than does the stakeholder, which is our employees. So the first thing to note here is that when CEOs and CFOs actually speak with investors, they seem to think of customers as a much more important stakeholder than employees. But worse, the sentiment analysis of this text analysis shows that when customers are being referred to in these investor calls, it's mostly in the context of challenges and difficulties, whereas customers, and when they get mentioned, it's more in the context of opportunities and positive salience. So there's something here that I think we all feel, which is that we all know and feel that workplace well-being matters a great deal, but a lot of senior leaders talk the talk, but don't actually walk the walk. And so I think there's a lot of room for improvement here. And I think I'm going to thank you all very much for your time so far. And I'm so pleased to say that we've got about 10-14 minutes left for a Q&A. So I'll stop sharing the presentation, hand back to Sarah, and hopefully there's some really cool questions waiting for us to engage on.